Many people in my field of psychology would wonder how in the world one could be interested in spirituality and how that might relate. The main thing behind that is to see it actually increases the potentiality of the change and the growth and the happiness that can actually occur. If we think about most of psychotherapy, and I've been trained in most of the psychotherapy systems. I was originally trained as a psychoanalyst. I began to see in that program, while it was very helpful in many ways, it did not really touch all problem areas that different people had. I began to get training and experience in almost every other modality, the major ones, from hypnosis to group therapy, to couples therapy, to gestalt therapy, to bioenergetic analysis, to cognitive behavior therapy, and so on. I could keep going. And then eventually into energy psychology and work with the energy meridians. Now, what's the purpose of all that? One is most of that is based upon the Newtonian worldview. That's of cause and effect and linear, where we are seeing a problem out there and we're finding a technique or an intervention that comes and changes that. Okay, that's useful in this linear world, just like it's useful when you're driving a car 60 miles an hour and your car has a certain weight. You know, you got to put on the brakes a certain number of feet back or you're going to crash into the car in front of you. So everything in the Newtonian world is not useless, much of it is very useful, but it covers only one dimension. And this other dimension that we call the spiritual dimension, or it's the same one being supported by much of the new physics of the last century, but in the spiritual dimension there's an invisible world that's far more powerful, and where there's infinite potentiality. One physicist, for example, John Wheeler, when he was at Princeton, made such an amazing statement for us to hear, especially coming from a physicist. He says, could it be that we bring the whole universe into existence through our consciousness? The key act is participation, he said, which is very similar to what many other physicists have said, 50 years before, that the minute you observe something, you've already changed it. You've already altered it, just by your participating in it through an act of observation. So when we add a spiritual dimension to our understanding of our problems, we can see that most of our problems are basically psychological in nature. They're learned behaviors, they're things that happen to us from our development and painful experiences that we had. Maybe even our genetic predispositions seem to play some role in there. But so much of that limits us. How often have I heard a supervisor say to a therapist, a young therapist in training, well, the most you can expect this person to do, given the nature of their problems, is to get about this far. You can maybe get this person to be fully functioning if you work for so many years and just give them some kind of support. What that does is place a limitation. And once we place the limitation in our own minds, we actually invoke that limitation to be a reality. I think of a story of Maynard Ferguson, the jazz trumpet player. If you're into jazz, you know that Maynard Ferguson was somebody who played those impossibly high tones on the trumpet that nobody else played. The story behind it's what's so interesting. As when Maynard Ferguson was a little boy, he heard jazz musicians practicing in the neighborhood, and he was really taken by it, and he wanted to learn to play a trumpet. His family had no money to buy one, so finally someday one of the trumpet players bought a new one and gave him the old one. Then he needs to learn to read music, but his family has no money for music lessons. So he has to sit down and teach himself how to read music. He did not know that he was playing every note an octave high on his trumpet. Not knowing that, he played tones that were considered totally impossible. His not having the belief system of limitations allowed him to go beyond that, and now many trumpet players play those same tones because they've learned it's possible. The same thing is true about psychotherapy. If we're working within a system of limitations about what we can do and what we can be, that one is going to constrict us. It's like imprisoning us. It's taking away our power. It's taking away our potentiality. It's not letting us see for ourselves or people we work with what their infinite potential is to accomplish things that they never thought possible. Whether it's in relationships or whether it's in their work, whether it's in finances or whatever it might be, they have potentialities that are immense. And from a spiritual perspective, it helps us learn that we are part of that source that has this infinite kind of power. That's our essential nature. And that essential nature is something we yearn for, but we're mostly frightened of it too. If we had to change our belief system to move out of the stance of a lot of the limitations we've been taught, it might be frightening to many of us. So we can make those changes most of the times just in increments, because it would be too overwhelming to think, gee, I have this immense power to do this thing that I never thought possible. What we need to know, though, is that we can keep increasing that. We can keep allowing ourselves to move out of that box. And from a spiritual perspective, we have this limitless capacity.